Professor mocked the black student until she spoke 7 languages. The lecture hall buzzed with low chatter as students shuffled into their seats, notebooks opening, laptops flickering to life. It was the first week of the semester, and expectations were high. The professor, an older white man known across campus for his stern demeanor and razor-sharp lectures, stood at the podium with his glasses low on his nose. He was a man who commanded silence, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the ivy-covered walls of the university. Among the rows of students sat Amara, a young black woman who had fought her way into this prestigious institution. Her journey had been anything but easy. While many of her classmates had grown up in private schools, traveled abroad, and spoken of gap years, Amara's path had been marked with late nights cleaning to help her mother pay bills, second-hand textbooks, and endless perseverance. She was quiet, observant, and carried herself with a dignity that came not from privilege, but from survival. That morning, as the professor began his lecture on linguistics, he posed a question to the class. A dozen hands shot up, but when Amara's hand followed, the professor's gaze lingered on her just a fraction longer than the others. She felt it, the weight of his judgment, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, the faint smirk tugging at his lips. Still, she held her hand steady. When he called on her, Amara rose slightly in her seat and offered her answer. Her voice was soft but confident, the trace of her Nigerian heritage lacing her accent. The words she spoke were precise, but before she could even finish, a chuckle slipped from the professor's throat. It was not the kind of laugh one shared with warmth or encouragement. It was sharp, dismissive, the kind that cut through her like a blade. The room fell silent for a moment, then a ripple of laughter spread among a few students in the back. Some glanced at her, some avoided her gaze entirely, and a few even smirked as though they had been given permission to belittle her. Amara's chest tightened, but she kept her eyes forward, refusing to let her expression falter. The professor shook his head, muttering something under his breath about clear communication and proper articulation, his tone dripping with superiority. Then, as if her contribution had been nothing more than a mistake, he quickly moved on, calling on another student as though she had never spoken at all. But inside, a storm brewed. Amara wasn't new to mockery. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and ridiculed more times than she could count. Yet, each time, it had only fueled something within her, a quiet fire that refused to be extinguished. Beneath her calm exterior, she carried a secret. For years, she had devoted every spare moment not just to her studies, but to mastering languages. French, Spanish, Mandarin, even German. Her nights had been filled with whispered phrases, recordings, and self-teaching. Language, to her, was more than words. It was power. And in that lecture hall, where she had been laughed at for her accent, Amara knew something the professor did not. She could speak more fluently than most of the very students who mocked her. The humiliation burned in her chest, but her silence that day was not weakness. It was preparation. Because one day soon, the laughter would stop. And when it did, it would be replaced by something else entirely: silence, awe, and a reckoning no one in that lecture hall would ever forget. Amara walked out of the lecture hall that morning with her books pressed tightly against her chest. The laughter still echoed in her ears. And though her face showed no expression, her heart carried the weight of humiliation. Every step through the campus courtyard felt heavier than the last. Around her, students laughed with friends, sipping expensive coffee, chattering about internships and vacations. None of them knew what it felt like to be laughed at for simply speaking. None of them knew the burn of being dismissed, before you even had the chance to prove yourself. But Amara knew. She had known it all her life. Back home, in a cramped apartment where peeling paint clung to the walls, and the sound of sirens often filled the night air, Amara's world had been one of survival. Her mother worked double shifts as a cleaner, her hands raw and blistered from scrubbing floors that never belonged to her. Her father had left years ago, leaving only silence in his place. For Amara, books became both her shield and her escape. She devoured them under the flickering light of a second-hand lamp, words becoming her companions, her teachers, her fuel. But it wasn't enough for her to just read. She longed for something greater, something that would make her impossible to ignore. One night, when her mother returned home exhausted and whispered in Yoruba, "Education is your weapon," the words struck Amara like lightning. From that night forward, she dedicated herself to languages. It started with French, an old book she found in a donation bin. Then Spanish. picked up from overheard conversations at her part-time job in a grocery store. Mandarin came later, more difficult, but she refused to give up. German followed, then Arabic, then Italian. She stuttered with intensity that bordered on obsession, staying awake long after the city had gone to sleep, repeating phrases to herself until her voice grew hoarse. What the professor and her classmates could never see was that the very accent they mocked was born not of ignorance, but of brilliance. Her tongue carried echoes of many languages, each word layered with the rhythm of cultures she had absorbed. What they called unclear was, in truth, a tapestry of fluency they could never imagine. But Amara kept it hidden, not because she lacked confidence, but because she understood something far greater. Timing was everything. Power revealed too early was power wasted. She let them laugh, she let them dismiss her, because deep inside she knew that one day, when the right moment came, the truth of who she was would shine, so brightly that no one could deny it. The more they mocked, the stronger she became. Their cruelty was fuel, and every night she burned it into discipline. In the silence of her room, as she repeated phrases in Dutch, her newest challenge, Amara imagined the day she would stand before them, not as the quiet black girl they overlooked, but as the woman whose voice carried the weight of every language she had ever mastered. She knew that day would come, and when it did, the laughter that once stung her like a whip would be silenced forever. The semester wore on, and the professor never missed a chance to remind Amara of her limitations. Each time she answered a question, he would smirk and cut her off mid-sentence. Each time she contributed to class discussions, he would raise his eyebrows and sigh as though her words were a burden. The other students followed his lead. Some laughed outright, others looked away awkwardly, pretending not to hear. But the silent message was clear: she did not belong. Amara said nothing. On the surface, she appeared unbothered. She took notes, kept her posture straight, and walked out of every lecture without confrontation. But beneath that calm exterior, she was sharpening herself like a blade. Every night, while her classmates rested, she was awake, training her mind, feeding her soul, preparing for the moment that would change everything. Then, one morning, the opportunity arrived. The professor announced that for the midterm project, each student would be required to deliver a presentation on European literature, not just reading from notes, but delivering an oral presentation, fluent, articulate, persuasive. He emphasized the word articulate while looking directly at Amara, and the smirk on his lips told the entire class what he expected: that she would fail, that her accent would betray her, that her humiliation would be complete. The whispers spread instantly. Some students chuckled. Others exchanged knowing glances. The stage was being set for her downfall. But Amara saw something different. For her, this was no trap. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The chance to reveal the truth she had guarded so carefully. When the day of presentations arrived, the lecture hall was buzzing. Students filed in, dressed neatly, holding their cue cards and laptops. The professor sat at the front, his arms crossed, his expression stern. One by one, students presented. French authors, German poets, Spanish dramatists. Their accents were neat, polished, but flat, memorized without depth. Finally, it was Amara's turn. She rose from her seat, her books in hand, and walked to the podium. A hush fell over the room. Everyone leaned forward, waiting for the stumble, the mistake, the awkward struggle they had been mocking all semester. Amara looked at them, her face calm, her eyes steady. She opened her notebook, not to read, but only to steady her hands. And then, with a breath, she began. Not in English, but in flawless, fluid French. Her voice carried with grace and rhythm, every word precise, every sentence flowing as though she had been born in Paris itself. The room stiffened. A few students glanced at each other, surprised but still unsure what they were hearing. Then she shifted. Without pause, she slipped into German. Perfect pronunciation, crisp consonants, each syllable delivered with the confidence of a native speaker. Gasps broke out across the room. The professor's smirk faltered. But Amara was not finished. She moved seamlessly into Spanish, her tone rich and melodic. Then Italian, smooth and expressive. Each language danced from her lips as if she had lived in their homelands, absorbed their cultures, and carried their essence within her. Finally, she looked directly at the professor, and in deliberate, measured Dutch, the very language he had once used to mock another student, she delivered the closing lines of her presentation. The silence that followed was unlike anything she had ever known. Not a single laugh, not a single whisper, only stunned faces and the heavy weight of realization pressing down on every person in the room. The professor's hands gripped the edges of his desk, his jaw tight. His eyes locked on Amara with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. And for the first time, she smiled. Because the moment she had imagined for so long had finally arrived. The silence in the lecture hall was unbearable. It wasn't the usual quiet that followed a routine presentation. It was the kind that swallowed every sound, pressing against the walls until even the hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. For weeks, the professor's laughter had filled this room, sharp and cutting, dragging Amara's dignity down in front of her peers. But now, there was no laughter, no mockery, only the heavy weight of disbelief. The students stared at her as though they had never seen her before. Their notes lay forgotten, their pens unmoving. Some had their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with shock. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the realization dawning on them that they had joined in the professor's cruelty, mocking someone who possessed a brilliance they could not even begin to touch. And then there was the professor. His smirk was gone. The superiority that once dripped from every glance, every gesture, had evaporated. His face, usually so composed, was flushed with a sudden wave of heat and shame. His eyes darted nervously, as though searching for an anchor, a way to reclaim control of the room. But there was none. For the first time, he was powerless. Amara did not gloat. She did not bow dramatically or demand recognition. She simply stood there, her notebook closed, her posture steady, her presence commanding. Her silence said everything her words did not need to, and that silence was louder than any applause. Slowly, a sound began to ripple through the lecture hall. It wasn't laughter. It wasn't mockery. It was clapping. At first, just one student at the back, tentative, uncertain. Then another. Then another. The rhythm grew stronger, filling the space, rising like a wave that broke the oppressive quiet. Within moments, the entire room was on its feet, applauding, not just the performance, but the courage, the resilience, the brilliance that Amara had revealed. The professor remained seated, frozen, his hands flat on the desk, his jaw locked tight. He looked small, shrunken under the weight of the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The truth that talent, intelligence, and worth were never bound by skin color, accent, or background. The truth that the very student he had belittled was the one who had shattered the illusion of his authority. Amara looked out at the sea of faces, all clapping for her now, but she wasn't fooled. She knew that applause could never erase the cruelty she had endured, nor the silence of those who had let it happen. But it was something. It was a shift, a crack in the walls of prejudice that had surrounded her since the first day she walked into that room. She gathered her notebook, offered a small nod of acknowledgement, and walked back to her seat with quiet dignity. Not triumphant, not boastful, but unshaken. And as she passed the professor's desk, she noticed something that almost made her pause. His eyes, red-rimmed and filled, not with anger but with something else, something closer to fear, because he knew, in that moment, that his power had been broken. The balance in the room had shifted. The hierarchy he had enforced was crumbling, and he had no control over what would happen next. The applause eventually died down, but the silence that followed was not the same as before. It wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was reverent, respectful. Something had shifted in the very air of that lecture hall. Amara sat down quietly, her notebook resting on her lap, her hands calm, though her heart still raced from the weight of what had just unfolded. She didn't crave the attention, nor did she bask in it. She simply sat, her gaze steady, carrying herself with the same dignity that had carried her through months of ridicule. The professor, however, was not the same man anymore. His once booming voice, sharp with arrogance, was gone. He stumbled through the remainder of the lecture, his words hollow, his confidence shattered. The authority he once commanded had slipped through his fingers, and everyone in the room knew it. By the time class ended, students didn't rush out as they usually did. They lingered. Many approached Amara, not with pity, but with admiration. Some apologized for their silence. Others confessed how her resilience had inspired them. And for the first time, Amara felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since the first day. She stepped into that room, belonging. News of what happened spread across campus like wildfire. Students whispered about the girl who had stunned an entire lecture hall, about how the arrogant professor had been humbled by the very person he mocked. Word reached beyond the classroom, reaching faculty and administrators. And then came the turning point. The university invited Amara to perform at a major academic event, a stage not for her to prove herself, but to showcase the brilliance that had been ignored and suppressed. She played again, not for validation, but for joy, for herself, for her ancestors who had been silenced, for every young black student who had been told they didn't belong. The audience that night gave her a standing ovation that lasted long after her. Final note. Professors, students, even the university board rose to their feet, not only for her music, but for what she represented: resilience, dignity, and the undeniable truth that greatness knows no boundaries. And the professor. He sat quietly in the audience, unable to hide. His arrogance was gone, replaced by the harsh weight of consequences. His mocking had once defined Amara's experience, but now his silence defined his own. For the first time, he was not feared, not admired. He was irrelevant. Amara's story became more than just a campus tale. It became a symbol. Students began to challenge prejudice openly, emboldened by her courage. Professors tread more carefully, aware that cruelty could no longer hide behind authority. But for Amara, the victory was personal. She had walked into that room carrying the burden of every stereotype, every doubt, every whisper of "you don't belong." And she had walked out carrying something else: respect, recognition, and the knowledge that she had turned humiliation into history. When she looked back on that day years later, she would remember not the professor's laughter, nor the sting of ridicule, but the silence, the moment when the world finally listened. A silence that had changed everything.